So stay tuned. Welcome again. Thank you for joining us tonight for our Wellness Wednesday. We're giving folks just a couple more minutes to log in and get settled, and then we're going to get started. So it is 6:35 and we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome again to Truth versus Non-Truth, the attack on our schools. And before we begin, we're actually going to pause for a moment of prayer. So if you could bow your head, close your eyes. Father God, we thank you tonight for bringing us together to learn more about what's happening in our current climate, And to find out more about how we can connect and advocate on behalf of our children and the community, we ask that you be with us tonight, the panelists, the moderator, and all those who are working to share this information so that the information is clear and receivable. Lord, we thank you for all the blessings that you have bestowed upon us. We thank you for the gift of life, health, and strength. And we ask that you continue to bless our families as we move forward in the work that we do. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All right. So before we begin, I want to just give some instructions for our time together. A couple of things. One, please keep yourself muted throughout the conversation. If you have a question, please place your question in the Q&A, not in the chat. And if you're watching this via YouTube or the Facebook page, you can post your questions on those sites and someone will share them on the Zoom so that we can address them. So during our time together this evening, I'm going to start with an introduction of myself and the panelists. We'll have a brief presentation by Ms. Cleo Brown, followed by a panel discussion with our panelists that I'm about to introduce, and then we'll end with a question and answer period. So I'm going to start with just introducing our panelists this evening. So my name is Letitia Vaughn, and I'm going to be the moderator of this evening's conversation. I am a career educator and founder of an organization, E3 Foundation, co-founder of an organization, the E3 Foundation, that focuses on ensuring all children have access to an equitable education. So our first panelist, I think, needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce her anyway. Ms. Cleo Brown Rowland is a national speaker and writer specializing in using history to help people better understand issues of race and voter suppression. She owns History Matters Institute and is the author of Witness to the Truth, a River Reed Summer Read Selection, and Raceology 101. First place winner in the 2018 National Federation of Press Women Nonfiction Book Competition. I will just say that I participated in several of Ms. Cleo Brown Rowland's talks, and I'm really excited to be having this conversation with her this afternoon. So our second panelist is AJ Davis. AJ is a committed community advocate who has dedicated his time and career to improving the quality of life of those around him. Much of his efforts have been focused on advocating for quality educational opportunities for youth, fair and affordable housing opportunities for people from all economic levels, and employment opportunities that provide fair and livable wages. AJ is an employee of the Charleston County School District and has served on the boards of numerous local community organizations and groups, oftentimes in leadership capacity. And his professional experience has been largely in nonprofit and community development organizations. He has a consulting business that is targeted towards nonprofit, community-based, and municipal organizations. And the name of that organization is called Community Solutions Consulting. AJ is also co-founder of an organization called the Low Country Black Parents Association. He is the father of a 12-year-old son, Jelani, who he loves dearly. And his hobbies include reading, music, exercise, travel, he says, when he has time, and he loves enjoying time with family and friends. I've had the privilege of knowing AJ through my work in the school district for many years and feel extremely privileged to be working alongside him in the work that he does. He is always out in the community, so welcome, AJ. And then our last panelist, Josh Malkin, joined the ACLU of South Carolina as a legal fellow in the fall of 2021. He came to the ACLU deeply committed to advocating for racial and educational equity and protecting the rights of children. Josh earned his Juris Doctorate from Columbia Law School graduating as a Stone Scholar and Public Interest honoree. While pursuing his degree, he had the privilege of interning for Orleans Public Defenders, the Mississippi Center for Justice, the New York City Civilian Review Board, and completing an externship with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Prior to law school, Josh spent 5 years teaching middle school and high school math in New Orleans East, where there he saw how American systems work in concert to maintain a racial hierarchy. I also have had the privilege of working with Josh on some of our coalition work, and am really excited that he's here and is ready to share with the group. So welcome all of our panelists this evening. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Ms. Cleo to do a brief historical presentation, and then we're going to dive into our panel discussion.
Okay, so thanks everyone for this opportunity to share with you all tonight. I am going to be sharing the screen right now. So just give me a minute. Okay, because I'm sharing a PowerPoint. Okay, all right, here we go. So, of course, you know that this is Black History Month, and we didn't want to do a Wellness on Wednesday without a little Black history. And this month, we're going to be talking about voting. And you will see later as we get into the discussion why we chose this topic, as everything or so many of the problems that we're dealing with right now can be tied back to our lack of voting or participating in the political process. So we're just going to take a little journey through history, starting with when the country began. And when the country began and all the new states were putting together their constitutions, only 2 states decided that they would specifically exclude Blacks from voting. And of course, you know, South Carolina had to be one of those states. Then they stayed in that position until the late 1860s. After the Civil War, they were able to vote during Reconstruction, and vote they did, because as you can see from this photo, we had a majority Black state legislature. And they, of course, that couldn't be allowed to stay in place. So there were attacks on them through violence, through changes of laws. And in the words of Governor Ben Tillman of South Carolina, how did we recover our liberty? By fraud and violence. We took the government away. We stuffed the ballot boxes. We shot them. We are not ashamed of it. So basically, African Americans stayed in this position of limited rights to vote for about 45 years until the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which just made it much easier for African Americans to exercise, and a lot of other groups to exercise their rights to vote. That stayed in effect until 2013, when we had this very bad Supreme Court decision to come down that took away many of the important parts of the Voting Rights Act, namely pre-clearance, which meant that people had to get permission, approval before they put in new laws to make sure that they didn't discriminate. So now that is the situation that we find ourselves now. But I want to kind of focus in on one particular issue that has come up in recent years, and that's us invalidating our own power by not voting. So recently, millions have been spent on social media campaigns to reduce the African American vote. And it's done through social media because it's easy to do. We tend to look at things without knowing who put them up, who's behind them. We share them, and so we're easier to manipulate. There was a campaign called Deterrence, and those ads and also the 2016 Russian election influence campaign had specific goals, and those goals were to convince African Americans that their vote didn't count, didn't matter, that they would stay at home and not vote, or that they would vote the wrong way following incorrect procedures, and that people who were actually for them were against them. Russia alone put up 30 pages on Facebook and Instagram with 1.2 million follows, and that was just for African Americans. Some of the fake pages that many followed, Black Matters US, Blackstagram, Blacktivist, William and Calvin, all of those were fake pages that were supposed to be for us and by us, and were neither. Did it work? Well, let's look at this blue line on this graph. In 1996, you see it starts going upward. The percentage of African Americans who are voting age, increased every 4 years. You can see it was going up, up, up. For 20 years, it went up until we were voting at larger percentages than the tan line, which was white Americans. Then you see it went on down. So it's a big issue now, not enough people voting. And then when you look at it by age group, you see the tan line, that's the 18 to 29-year-olds at the bottom, very little voting. The blue line, the 30 to 44-year-olds. And the main people not voting, the young adults and low-income people, are the people who are most impacted by all of these laws coming down the road. So let's look at it at the state level. When we look at how few people participated in the runoff, like the state superintendent of education, she won that election with 111,000 votes. There are 3.3 million registered voters in South Carolina. Let's look at Charleston County. In the primary, only 16% of the people voted. Some precincts had less than 10%. In the runoff, 4.4%. In the general election, it was better, but a lot of stuff had already been decided in the primaries and in the runoffs. So general election, 59%. So I like to say all of this we need to think about, because one of the people, I give you an example where we are having problems, that person won by 5 votes, only 5 votes. So I sum everything up into this one saying: if you don't do politics, politics will do you. So we have got to step up to the plate and start taking care of business and stop letting politics do us. Thank you.
Wow, Ms. Cleo. I feel like we just need to pause on that information, because that was a lot of information, but also very informative, useful, and hopefully motivating as we think about how we plug in to the legislative process and what our minimum responsibility is, which is to go out and vote. And so I just want to make a clear connection, because the topic of our our panel discussion tonight has to do with the attack on our schools, truth versus non-truth. And so draw the line and make the connection for everybody who is listening. We talked about voting, and you talked a little bit about the superintendent and how the superintendent of education and that vote and how much she won by. But I actually want you to draw a direct line. Why is this important as we're talking about the attack on our schools?
Well, I say that it is most important because it is very difficult to fix things after the fact. we should be more about prevention than repair. And you can only prevent by making sure that people who represent your children and your interests are elected to represent your area. So now we have groups of people who have been elected who represents a very small group of people. And they are basically forcing their will up on the majority of the people. And so it is so critical that we start thinking about how do we organize, how do we get information to younger adults who have the children in school to get them informed about before elections as to who is running and what they stand for. So I think that's where we're trying to make this line, because when people listen today, they will actually see for themselves just how serious this is, and that you have to have a dog in the fight. You have to be represented.
Yep, thank you for that. And thank you for drawing that direct connection. And so I want to bring Josh and AJ into this conversation. And we're actually going to start with the bill that we're talking about, that is the attack on our schools. So there is a bill currently in our legislative process called the Inequities in Education Bill. So we want to talk to you about what this bill is, how we actually got to where we are right now. So Ms. Cleo gave us some voting rights history, but I want to make sure that you also have some context as to what's been going on nationally and regionally, and how we got to the point where we have this bill called the Inequities in Education Bill. I'm going to ask Josh and AJ to come into the conversation. And Nairobi, if you can pull up the historical slides so that they can begin that discussion. Yep.
All right, good evening. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Josh, do you want to go ahead and get started with that? And I can piggyback off of you.
Sure, yeah. It's great to be with everyone. I hesitate to speak history when we've got a real historian in the room here. But basically every time there's been the semblance of racial progress in this country's history, there's been a swift and violent backlash, right? So you think about Reconstruction and how Jim Crow came shortly after. You think about the Civil Rights Movement and how mass incarceration and the war on drugs came shortly after. My belief is that this current movement to erase discussion of systemic injustice, racial inequities from our students' education is in response to the horrific and public murder of George Floyd, right? Folks worried that the white power structure appeared to be listening and they needed to respond to that. So my belief is that this current movement to erase discussion of race, racism, inequity from our children's discourse is in response to the fear that more people are realizing just how inequitable our society is. So should I speak a little bit to the slide, Letitia? Probably,
I think
right?
you should. I think you should.
So summer 2020 is when George Floyd is murdered. Folks are taken to the streets. Sometime in here in this timeline, a man who I won't say his name out loud because I don't give him credence. He tweeted that critical race theory is, unpatriotic. We're demonizing America. And within days, Trump is taking action. And Trump is saying, we need to eradicate divisive concepts from our government. And from there, very shortly after, you saw the exact same legislation, the same exact bills pop up in states across the South.
All right. Do you want me to go ahead and jump in now, Josh?
Yeah, whatever you're feeling, AJ. I'm here for it.
Okay. Okay. All right. So one of the things that Josh is pointing out, good evening, everyone. My name is AJ Davis, is that this is, in fact, what we're seeing a backlash to. I would like to add the summer of social justice, which was 2020. And if many of you remember, that was also the first summer of the pandemic. So we were basically still dealing with the fallout from Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then, of course, George Floyd. That was the unholy trinity of violent actions towards Black people. We also saw a tremendous number of corporations and actions taken to show solidarity with Black communities. Black Lives Matter was being painted on streets, and streets were being renamed, and all of that. And as Josh mentioned, there was a backlash to that. And I would like to add, it was a political backlash because this was also the summer of the presidential election year. Many of you may or may not remember how during the Republican National Convention, the theme was lawlessness, violence, the riots, if you will, of 2020, where conservative Republicans attempted to paint this picture that Black Lives Matter and the protests for social justice was lawlessness that was besieging American cities. And so, as Josh stated, and I will go ahead and call the gentleman's name because it's important for folks to know that there was a person behind this. Christopher Rufo is the name of the gentleman who basically is the linchpin for the anti-CRT, anti-woke agenda that we're seeing right now. He is a pseudo-journalist. He has made a name for himself in conservative circles, basically stoking fear, stoking animosity, but he's been extremely, extremely successful in being able to make pushing back against a progressive agenda for Black and marginalized people political capital for right-wing candidates. If you remember, the governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, actually won on a successful platform of anti-CRT. So I want people to go ahead, Letitia.
I was going to say, can I pause for a second? Because you guys have mentioned a couple of terms that I think we need to make sure that everybody who's listening is really clear on. So you talk about CRT, and I know people have heard this term CRT, but I want to make sure that people know what CRT is and know what it is not, and understand where CRT is taught. So that's one. And even though CRT isn't really referenced in the current bill, we feel like it's important that you understand where all of this stems from. So can someone please answer that question? What is CRT? What is it not? And where is CRT taught?
Sure. Josh, I'll let you, since you are the legal scholar, and this is more so in your arena, I'll let you start out.
All right. So critical race theory is a graduate level field of scholarship that examines how the law perpetuates racial inequity. I took critical race theory in law school. Much of it went over my head. Can promise you it's not being taught in K through 12 schools. The problem is, and Christopher Rufo takes credit for this, that after they defamed critical race theory, they successfully confused it with anything they wanted. And what that means here is any talk of racial justice, racial inequity. So while the legislators got a little bit wiser this year, and they heard all of our comments last year about how this is not actually critical race theory and took that language out of the bill, the animus and the intent are the same. They do not want children learning about racial inequities, and they will use whatever language they are told is savviest to achieve that goal.
And can we go to the next slide, please? So this may be hard for folks to see, but this is the presidential order that Josh was referring to that came out of the conversations about critical race theory. And as Josh mentioned, it is a graduate level course. It is not and has never been a part of any K-12 public school curriculum, any K-12 public school educational standard, and it is not taught as a subject in any K-12 public schools in America. But as Josh stated, what has happened is opponents of progressive legislation and progressive progress have made the term CRT, the umbrella, almost synonymous with anything beneficial to Black marginalized communities, because in this we see a very heinous attack on members of the LGBTQIA plus community, and basically any language in any type of educational materials that does not center whiteness as the absolute standard of goodness in our society. Can we go to the next slide?
So before we overview the bill, AJ and Josh and Ms. Cleo, there's another term that we want to bring to the forefront that you may hear, and that is the term indoctrination. And so can we pause and talk about indoctrination and this disinformation campaign movement?
Ms. Cleo, I think you can definitely lead us off with that, because I know you definitely have a grasp of it.
Well, I was going to leave it to you guys. Well, the pushers of this are saying that we are, or people like me, who teach history, who promote accuracy in history, that we are indoctrinating children to believe that white children are quote unquote bad and just because of the color of their skin. But I think one of the things that I brought up at the hearing was, if your child is hearing the truth in history, then why does your child identify with the bad or cruel enslaver and not the abolitionist? Then to me, that was a reflection on you as the parent, that your child would identify in that way. But they have pushed this messaging through websites, through churches all over the country, that
battery is going down.
Promote accuracy.
Yeah, that was the other problem with that camera. Press
People
the
who promote
press the red
accuracy are just trying to indoctrinate people and convince them that white people are bad just because they are bad. I mean, just because they are of a certain color.
Yep. So thank you for expounding on that, because we want to really be clear as to how we got to where we are today and the intent behind the current bill. And so now I want Josh to start us off, giving us an overview of the current bill, Bill 3728.
Yeah, so I'll echo the sentiment that the intent of this bill is to chill educators' speech regarding racial injustice, regarding racial inequity, regarding queerphobia, sexuality, gender identity. It will certainly do that, and there are a few dangerous avenues by which it will do that. I mean, I think the bill existing does that. We've heard reports from educators just like, this bill existing, educators are already thinking about what they're saying and censoring themselves. But this bill also has a complaint process whereby a parent can complain, to the administration. And there was actually good language in this bill that said that the parent needed to show that they had made an effort to meet with their students, teacher, and administration. And that's good, because I think a lot of times these attacks are not being brought by parents. They're being brought by outside folks. And I think that parents largely support their students, teachers, and this is not really an actual issue. But when the bill got to the full House, the 100 and some odd folks, the bill was amended to include that any parent anywhere in the state can bring a lawsuit against a school district if they feel the school district is not acting quickly enough. Also, if a complaint is found to be valid, the school district loses 5% of their funding. So now if you're an administrator, and I'm not, Letitia, you could speak to this. If you are an administrator, if you are a district official, and you are up against a complaint or a lawsuit where you are thinking about the overall well-being of your district and losing 5% of your funding, not wanting your teachers to be involved in lawsuits, and you have the decision of standing up for what's right, what you know is right, or protecting the students and educators in your district, you're just putting folks in an impossible situation. So both through the complaint process and the withholding of funds, and also now there's you can go straight to a lawsuit, where these bills were kind of already chilling educators' speech, the threat of economic impact, of legal impact, will only really, I think, amplify the fear that educators and administrators feel.
Absolutely. And so,
Can I say something on that?
please, Ms. Cleo.
Because, okay, so after all of the hearings last year, they basically took all that information of what were the protests against the bill that they introduced last year. And what they have basically done was to put in a system of intimidation and fear that they don't have to put in the bill. You can't talk about equity, can't talk about Black history, they have put so many penalties, and the penalties are so huge. You're talking about like $5 million just for Charleston County, the fine, coming out of the treasury of Charleston County schools. You don't have to put, because if you put the words in there, then it would be easier to say this is a racist bill. But what they've done is just done it in such a way that the fear itself will achieve the objective without putting the actual words in there again.
Yes. Thank you for that addition. And Josh, one of the things that you referenced is I was a former administrator and worked for a school district. And this process that is being discussed actually circumvents every process that a school and a district has in place to deal with parental issues and complaints. So that's just another aspect. There actually are protocols in place within districts, within schools, to deal with parent concerns. The process that they are creating or that they're proposing actually circumvents the processes that are currently in place, which is also an issue. And so before we talk about like the legislative process and where this bill is, I do want to also just expand a little bit from everyone's perspective on what this actually looks like across the state, what's happening regionally, and what's happening kind of locally, because this is actually playing out in different ways, not only across our state, but across our country. And so I want you all to have some context and understand that this is not only a statewide issue, it is a national issue, but there are also localized issues that are adjacent to this conversation. So Josh, I want to have you just start with kind of a big picture, and then we can talk about like some of our regional and school district issues that are going on that are aligned with these issues, this same conversation.
We talking book bans?
All of it.
Okay. Yeah, so essentially everything we're seeing at the statewide level, we're seeing locally as well. So this past summer, I spent the bulk of my time chasing book banners around the state. And they are disproportionately targeting books that either feature Black characters, talk about race, written by Black authors, or similarly with queer characters, queer authors, queer themes. And again, it's this erasure, right? It's this, we are worried that our children will be more empathetic, will be more understanding, will be more able to help devise societal solutions. And what's our response to that? We're going to restrict their access to information. So I've been in every corner of the state talking about book bans. We're seeing similar things. I'm sure AJ will get into. We're seeing very similar things when it comes to curriculum and what's being taught in the classroom. But I will just say, like, educators are understandably scared. You have parents saying, "I need to come into your classroom and see your whole library." You have educators thinking about how they're going to talk about a certain topic because they're afraid of parents or non-parents coming in and saying, "You can't do that. You're being racist." Because right now in South Carolina, being racist means discriminating against white people. Freedom in South Carolina means the freedom to discriminate. So I as much as it pains me, I tip my hat in the work that they do in controlling language and controlling messaging, because that they've co-opted, they are successfully attempting to co-opt that language.
So I do also want to jump in here, Letitia, if I may, and not only echo what Josh has stated, but also to help the folks in the audience understand that this all was also done in the midst of a global pandemic, in which families, schools, everybody was trying to remain safe. We were trying to navigate an unprecedented event, something that most of us have never experienced in our lifetime. But while we were doing that, these folks were actually organizing and engaging. You can actually draw a correlation between the folks who were protesting masks and vaccine mandates and the people who are behind these bills. And in essence, mask mandate deniers and vaccine and COVID deniers were the Trojan horse for what we're seeing right now. They used the specter of parental concern. When you saw videos around the country of folks showing up at school board meetings saying that wearing a mask was tantamount to fascism and government control. You saw that around the country. Those were groups. One prominent group, I should say, since we're talking on a national level, is Moms for Liberty. That group arguably has become the face organization for what we are battling with bills like this in South Carolina. And so these individuals are made up primarily of white women, white families, and white adjacent minorities who have decided to hijack the process, as Letitia said, of who has a parent voice. Their platform has been parent voice in education, and it's been extremely successful. And I want people to understand that it's been successful because the politicians that they're influencing can say that they're responding to parents and families. And they made a campaign of saying this is about getting the government out of the business of raising children. And so because the media, because there has been little opposition, they've been able to gain traction to the point where there are 42 states, last I count, that have either passed a bill or right at the edge of passing a bill of some kind that's censorship and denies teachers the right to have autonomy in their own classrooms. And so that has now trickled down here in South Carolina at the state level, where we see this bill and also other actions that jeopardize the autonomy of teachers and school districts. Most notably, if many of you remember, November was the midterm election, but also some very contentious school board races. Our neighbor to the north, Berkeley County, saw 6 Moms for Liberty backed candidates be swept into office. And as almost immediately, they took about the business, they took about the business of finding a way to get rid of the first Black superintendent in that county. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. And so the agenda is not just passing censorship legislation, it is taking control of the mechanisms of information and how our children are provided with that information and education. And so as the public, it is our responsibility to not only be vigilant in that, but to be able to recognize it, as Ms. Cleo said, and call it out when necessary. I do want to pause, Letitia, because I don't know how far down you want us to go with this.
Yes, so thank you for that. And locally, one of the things that you all said that I think is really important and an indication of how far this will go, in one of our local recent school board elections, Darren Calhoun, who was just voted into the West Ashley seat, the Moms for Liberty group on their campaign materials indicated that we should not vote for Darren because he is for racial and social justice. And so we want you to understand kind of how far reaching this reach is and the implications and how it is impactful to us right now. So we don't have a lot of time left because we want to spend time with question and answer, but I do want Josh to talk about where this bill is in the legislative process. And we're going to talk about what we can do and how we can plug into the process to make our voices be heard. So Nairobi, I think there is a slide for the legislative process. If you could pull that up just as a visual for the folks who are on. You can go forward. One more. Yep, there we go.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the bill, despite members' requests for this bill not to be debated during Black History Month, during Black Lives Matter Action Week, on the anniversary of the Orangeburg Massacre, they did it anyway. It did pass out of the full House on party lines and now sits with the Senate. There's some optimism that the Senate will not take this bill up. They're generally a more thoughtful body and probably see this bill for what it is. But rather, wanting to be safe rather than sorry, we need to be ready. So a few options. We don't want to, email senators right now in worry that it might bring unwelcome attention to this bill that we think is kind of being ignored in the Senate right now. So I have 2 recommendations. One, get your testimony ready, get your written testimony ready. So when the time comes, if it is taken up, we can make sure our legislators know how we feel. And then 2, I know this is a big ask. We will have somewhere, if this is to get taken up by the Senate, we will have somewhere between like 24 and 96 hours notice. So I know it's a big ask, but for folks who are able to make the trip from Charleston or wherever you are to Columbia on that day to testify or be present, that is kind of the most impactful day at the State House, where we can show up en masse and let our elected representatives know that this is not something that South Carolina wants or needs. And also, I'm sorry, one more thing. Whatever you all can do on the call to educate other folks, and if you want to have follow-up conversations with myself, Letitia, AJ, I'm sure we're all here for it. But to educate other folks, because I really think that most people in South Carolina, understandably, don't understand what's happening at the State House. So the more that we can spread the word about this happening in our state and let more people know, the better. Because I'll say their folks are fairly active. I think they are much smaller in number than us, but they are more active. So the more that we can help let folks know what's going on and activate them and let them know how they can engage in this fight, I'm just, whatever we can do to be ready for a potential Senate fight.
And can I just clarify with you, Josh, so that everybody understands, because I don't want to take it for granted that people understand every step of the legislative process. And like, we just started doing this work a couple years ago, and I am still trying to like pull back all the layers to understand the process. So the bill has been in the House. Like, walk people through step one, what's happening next, and like all the steps.
I'm sorry. Yes, thank you for flagging that, Letitia. So the bill is out. The House said yes. So that immediately sends the bill over to the Senate. The Senate essentially announces, hey, this bill is here. They send it to the Committee of Education in the Senate. It now really is up to the chairman of that committee, who is Senator Hembree out of Horry, to give the bill a hearing. He has a whole lot of power in determining whether or not the bill is even heard in the Senate. There are a few other influential folks who can kind of put some pressure on him to give the bill a hearing, but he has a whole lot of discretion in setting what that committee hears. And because he as an individual didn't have an appetite for it last year, these bills died last year. I don't know if folks know that, but South Carolina was one of a very small number of states where we killed these bills. And it's because there was such massive mobilization when the bill was in the House. Senator Hembree saw that and said, I know what this is about, and I'm not trying to bring this circus on in the Senate.
So, Josh, like, I need you to like make people understand the power of being in person at the Senate or at the Education Committee hearings. So like last year, there were 3 hearings, and we stacked the hearings where we had people there in person. We sent written testimony. I want you to make people understand the importance of that one hearing.
Yes. So last year, to Letitia's point, we were given 18 hours of hearing, which is completely unusual. And I think in response to how many complaints and concerns they heard from South Carolinians. But the House gave us 18 hours. And folks on the pro-Black history side of things made up approximately 15 to 16 of those hours. So not only did the House kind of reconsider their language based on what they heard, but the Senate was also watching. And the Senate does not have all that much respect for the House as it is. But when the Senate sees the House is being embarrassed right now by public sentiment, they said, we're not touching this. So if for whatever reason, Senator Hembree decides to give this bill a hearing, it is our biggest lever to pack that room, to let senators know, to let the more deliberative body know that we understand the intent of this bill, regardless of what the language might say, and we do not want or need it in South Carolina. And I do think that the Senate, again, being this more thoughtful body, there are a few folks who could have their votes changed if they see a real outpouring of public opposition to the bill. Letitia, did I answer?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you. And so can you forward one slide? And so what we want to emphasize with you, one more, I'm sorry, is the importance of not only voting, but how we move the extra step and take action. And so we wanted Josh and team to really help us think about not only the legislative process, because we don't want to make an assumption that everybody knows, because Josh is there every day. We're not. So we need to get clear on how we can plug in. So one of the things that Josh talked about is like this 24-hour to 96-hour notice that we're going to get regarding the Education Committee hearing. So how do you know about things like that? And how can you take action? So let's talk about that as we wrap up the conversation. Let's talk about the current coalitions, how you can get information. Let's talk about ways that you can plug in. So I'm going to start with Ms. Cleo actually jumping in and talking about church and faith-based communities and other ways that she would recommend that we take action on issues like this.
Okay, I was jotting some notes down as you all were talking. I think we have to remember that like when we were doing the hearings last time, that it was a very small group that was for these bills, but the groups that were against the bill were far wider. They were the group for it was only people from churches. And you will see throughout the country, when we heard Governor Huckabee talk about it, it's always talked about in terms of God, religion. This is a religious movement. It is religiously pushed. All the websites, you will find God, something about God. So I have been talking to white people who are Christians, and we've had discussions. I've had whole tables of discussions. I've had one-on-one discussions, because they really need to understand what this movement is about and how people are getting pulled into it. So that's one of the things that I talk about. And we need pastors talking, Black pastors talking to white pastors. We need people talking to people on their jobs. We need, because you've got to have cross support in order to move senators and legislators. You've got to make it a matter to them. And that what was scary to them the last time was it was so many different groups that were against it, large groups. And so if we can get more and more people knowledgeable of it, then we can get more people taking action against it. It can't be just Black people going to speak against it. Then the other thing is, when I talk to some of my legislators, I'm talking from a different perspective. I'm talking about teacher retention, losing teachers, not having enough teachers, because if you're going to have this potential noose over their neck where anybody in the entire state of South Carolina can file a claim against your school, that's like a noose around your neck. And so I have been able, at least I feel like I've made some inroads with some legislators talking, white legislators, in talking about the schools and the teacher situation, which is actually important to them, because if they are bringing in all of this new industry, they need to have schools. I have been providing historical perspectives. Who started this? Why this is happening this way? What is the purpose of it? And so it's really an education process, but we have to really, really talk to our young adults who have children in school. I don't know how, but we have got to convince them to become politically active. And so that means every person on this call, every person listening, you need to go and talk to somebody under the age of 35 about their need to get involved and to know what's going on in their school. Because when that $5 million get pulled out of Charleston County, it's going to be a lot of unhappy parents, and they need to head this off at the pass. So those are the main things that I could think of right now. We've got to get broad support, different organizations across the spectrum.
Thank you, Ms. Cleo. Josh, can you talk a little bit about the coalitions that are currently in existence and how people can get ongoing information?
Sure. Yeah. The Pro-Truth SC Coalition is the coalition that originated to combat legislation just like this. Originally founded by the ACLU of South Carolina, the E3 Foundation, the Low Country Black Parents Association, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And you can stay updated with them by going to protruthsc.org and signing up for the email list. So you'll get notified about all the upcoming meetings, legislative updates, local attempts to censor classroom curriculum as well. And then Freedom to Read, South Carolina on Facebook and Twitter. Freedom to Read SC was created to respond directly to attempts to ban books. There is a whole lot of overlap with folks who are members of both coalitions. And a lot of the you can find a lot of the same information in both places, but please, please, please join Pro-Truth. And if you're on social media, follow both Pro-Truth and Freedom to Read.
Thanks, Josh. And then AJ, can you talk a little bit about local actions and other things that folks might do in order to organize, mobilize, stay connected?
Okay, thank you, Letitia. So one of the most significant and basic things I will encourage folks on this call to do is to make sure that you are plugged into your local school board, your local school district. Make sure that you understand when the schedule of meetings are. Make sure you understand when certain events are coming up. One of the things that these groups use is people's apathy and indifference. Here in Charleston County School District, excuse me, meets at least twice a month. One is the committee of the whole meeting. The other is the full board of trustee meetings. That's the second and fourth Mondays of the month. That agenda is usually posted the Thursday before the meeting. Familiarize yourself with your local school district's website. A lot of information is put on the website that a lot of people don't know. But I want to also piggyback on what both Josh and Ms. Cleo said, that you have to be vigilant. If you have school-age children, please make sure you have a relationship with their teachers and the administrators in their school buildings, because one of the other areas of attack that these groups are using is the lack of community support. For years, we've always heard the failings of public education, and they've demonized and vilified public education to the point where community support is not there. That's one of the most basic steps that I encourage people to look at locally. If you're not a member of the PTA or PTSA, please check to see if your school has that and be a part of it. The other thing I want to emphasize for folks on the call, because this is also vitally important, This is something that regardless of whether or not you have children who are school age or in school, we need all hands on deck because this is something that is jeopardizing the future of millions of children. Millions of children are at risk if we don't pretty much draw a line in the sand now and begin to bring communities around supporting public education. Yes, public education has its flaws. However, those flaws do not supersede the value that it is providing to our children and our families who desperately need it. And so, again, the emphasis is get involved, get engaged, and stay vigilant. I'll stop there.
AJ, before we move to question and answer, one big topic that we did not talk about that I at least want you to say at 1 minute of things on is just last night, there was a school board meeting in which you were there until 10 o'clock last night. Please talk to the audience about why we needed to be there, and what was happening.
So for residents of Charleston County, there is a curriculum that is currently being used in our elementary and middle schools that was a piloted curriculum called EL. All right. I apologize for not knowing exactly what the EL stands for, but what you need to know is that this curriculum provides teachers with resources that are diverse and culturally inclusive. And so little Black and brown children are reading books and passages that reflect their lived experiences. And as a result of that, this curriculum is providing many Black and brown students with a reinvigorated sense of loving, of learning, and reading. Literacy is one of the biggest issues that we see in education right now. And literacy rates, especially for Black children, are, excuse me, at levels where we need to raise them. But last night in the CCSD board meeting, which went from 4:15 until a little after 10 o'clock last night, there were once again at least 20 something teachers, students, and parents who came out in favor. This is in addition to what happened just last week, where we had over 64 people sign up to speak with at least 57 to 58, once again, speaking in favor. But even with those numbers, the current school board for Charleston County School District still attempted to remove this curriculum from, excuse me, from the schools that it's already in. This curriculum has not even had a full year of vetting, but even in the short time that it has been in schools, teachers and principals have seen tremendous results, and they've seen positive outcomes. And most importantly, for those who didn't attend the meeting, the children, the students themselves really enjoyed and spoke positively about how this curriculum gave them a sense of love, of learning and reading again. And so that's why it's important. And I know those meetings can be tedious, and normally they're not that long, but they can be. But that's why we need people who are able to continuously show up to these meetings and sign up to speak and voice your opinion and email your school board members. Because another thing, before I stop, another thing that was said by the board members, various ones who were in opposition to this curriculum, is that they received hundreds of emails from people who were in opposition. However, none of them were able to read one email stating otherwise. So I'll stop there.
And before Ms. Cleo has her hand raised, so I want to give her a chance to speak before we go into question and answer. One of the things that AJ said, I think is really important that we emphasize around literacy. Right now in Charleston County, only 51 of the students in kindergarten through 8th grade are reading below grade level. 83% of Black students in third grade do not read on grade level. This is why it's important that we get involved. Ms. Cleo?
Oh, well, you've already taken it down. I was just going to remind the people to take a picture with their phones of all those contact numbers and emails. So maybe we can put it up at the end where they can take a picture.
Let's put it back
You're
up.
muted.
But right now I want to go to some of the questions in the chat. So I'm going to read off the questions that are in the question and answer. So I'll read off the questions, and whoever from our panel wants to jump in and answer, please just take the lead. So the first comment says, the proposed bill is extremely subjective. Is that not a blatant violation of the First Amendment? Shouldn't it be challenged if it were to become law? If so, those teachers would need to have financial support through the litigation process. Can someone take that question?
We'll defer to the lawyer on the panel because, yeah.
Well, I was hoping he was just going to jump in.
Yes, there are legal claims. This is currently being challenged in both Missouri and Florida. The strongest claim is that the language is so vague that teachers don't know what they can and cannot say. And in terms of teacher funding, I may know some organizations that can help out with that. So if we come to that point, teachers do not need to be worried about the funding of it.
Thank you, Josh. The next question is, does this banning apply only to public schools or private schools included? So talk about the law and the proposed bill and who it would apply to.
AJ, I don't know which one of us wants to go off on this one.
we can tag team. Could you read the question again? Listen, I want to make sure I answer this for the folks to really understand.
Does this bill or banning apply only to public schools, or are private schools included?
So for folks who are watching, South Carolina, in another separate but related incident, is also trying to divert public school funds to go to private schools. So these actions are specifically targeted towards public schools. And that's the interesting thing. They're specifically targeted to basically tie the hands of teachers and school level administrators and even school districts themselves. To give you an example, again, at last night's board meeting, one of the board members for District 7, Leah Watley, mentioned that one of the reasons why they wanted to address the EL curriculum was because there were lawsuits already being levied and that there were potential laws that would make curriculum like EL illegal. Now, I want to pause because I know folks who may just now be getting into this conversation may not understand what that means, but it means that a sitting school board member is also paying attention to the legislation that is in play at the State House, which is not a bad thing, but they are using that legislation almost as a precursor to actions that they are attempting to take regarding curriculum. It was also noted last night that state law does not give school boards the authority to remove curriculum. The responsibility, the statute clearly states that the board shall give the authority for the implementation of curriculum to the superintendent and staff. But we have a 5-4 majority. One of the things that the board chair said that I think folks in Charleston County needs to pay attention to, when the ultimate measure to send the idea of eliminating the curriculum up to the board meeting next week, and it was voted down, the board chair said, well, don't we have control of the budget? So please understand that these individuals are taking multiple actions, some of them direct, some of them indirect, because when she said about being able to control the budget, that means that they are looking at, if they can't get it through one direction, they're going to come back in another. And that's why it's so vital, so very vital for communities and the public to be paying attention to what your local school boards are doing. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, AJ and Josh. The next question, and maybe Ms. Cleo, you can handle this one. Are churches allowed to teach Black history? You're muted.
Okay, as long as I've been doing this and I'm still forgetting to unmute. But I was going to say, oh, definitely. Of course, Royal has taught Black history. So churches can teach Black history. And if people are interested in starting a class, or, that might be something that I could work on putting together if we had the interest. I think it's important to know what you don't know. And so, yes, we can definitely provide that knowledge through the churches.
Perfect. Thank you. And then there were just a couple of comments. EL stands for expeditionary. I can never pronounce that word, expeditionary learning. So that's what the EL stands for. And then there was also a comment that the public can FOIA emails. So I think that that's also a really important piece of information. FOIA actually stands for Freedom of Information Act. And so as a person who is a taxpayer, you are able to request access to things like emails because they are public information for the institutions that, like school districts that are doing public work.
And I want to add to that, I want to jump in, Letitia, because that is a very valid point. However, I want the public to also know that the individuals and the organizations involved are working oftentimes in tandem with folks in districts and whatnot. And so with FOIA, while yes, you do have a right to request that information, the caveat is, depending upon what you request, the organization, in this case, the school district, for example, will charge you for that request. And I want you to understand, because this is what is happening in other states and other parts of the country, and they are trying to make that a barrier for the general public. So, for example, if you request, let's say, emails of the board, and you request from a particular time frame, or let me back up. You make a general request. If you say, I want to get emails from September to December of 2022, they'll say, okay, we will provide you with that. But because of the cost or administrative cost that we will incur, we're going to charge you X amount of dollars per page. So it is best, and I've learned this from talking with other groups in other states, that as precise a request as you can make it, and in some cases, you may need to already be thinking about the funds you will have in place to pay this, because they are trying their best to make sure that the general public cannot get in the way of what it is they're trying to do. I just wanted to put that out there, Letitia.
Thank you, AJ. Quick question, and then I'm actually gonna go in reverse order of the questions that I see, but there was a comment that said the answer wasn't clear. Does Bill 3728 apply to private schools? Say it out loud, lawyer.
No.
It does not. So please be clear, Bill 3728 does not apply to private schools.
In fact, let me say this. Most of the censorship type legislation that you will see does not, and that should be the giveaway for the public, does not apply to private schools. However, most of the bills that are designed to remove and give funding to private, remove public school funding are designed to benefit private schools with little to no oversight. Basically, they're trying to give private schools public school dollars without having to have the public school accountability. This is not about equitable education. I want people to understand that. This is specifically to target public education and to dismantle it, to cripple it to the point where the general public will lose faith in it, lose the belief in its value, and then be open to the dismantling of it. There are already educational companies that are springing up that are paying attention to not only the censorship bills, but they're paying attention to the school funding bills that are happening right now. Tennessee, for example, Tennessee was about to give away almost a third, if I'm not mistaken, of their public schools to one educational company. And I want to back up real quick, Letitia, something that Ms. Cleo said when asked about the what can churches do. I want the viewers to understand one major part of this movement to attack public schools is driven by white Christian nationalism. The references to God and those things are oftentimes deceiving because for people of the Christian faith, you will probably ask, well, why don't we have prayer in schools? And why? Yes, a parent should be able to make decisions for their children as they deem fit. And that's where the misleading and the deceitful nature, the disinformation comes into play, because every state has educational and academic standards that are vetted by professionals. Without question, there is no state academic standard that will put any educational material in a classroom that is not age appropriate and materially appropriate. So when you hear people saying, oh, they're exposing kindergartners to pornography, they're not. They're not. That is what has been the national talking point that has been put out there. And they're using the church as a Trojan horse because they feel as though by wrapping it in religion, and in this case, Christianity, white Christianity, that people will be reluctant to truly push back on what it is they're trying to do. So I'll stop there.
Yes, so thank you for you all's answer to that. And I just want to clarify, generally, private schools accept private dollars and they follow their own rules and bylaws. Most of the time, private schools don't follow the same curriculum as public schools. They may have a different calendar as public schools than public schools. They have their own board of directors, so they don't even align with the school boards. And so for there to be, and this is again a separate issue, but for there to be a push for private schools to be to have public dollars with no oversight is an issue, because public schools are subject to oversight, and that is really the purpose of a school board and a curriculum that is approved by state, etc. And so I just want to be clear, because there's that question about, does the bill apply to private schools? It does not, because a private school, by nature of it being private and by nature of it being funded by private dollars, then is not subject to public rules of oversight like a public school would be. So there are a couple more comments and questions, and then so I'm going to hit one, and then I want to pause and give everybody kind of a closing word before we leave this evening. So there was a comment that we all can read, basically indicating the United States should be ashamed for being so far behind the times, as well as an experience of when one of our participants went to a high school and South Carolina history was taught, and now teachers can't teach Black history. And there was a question about lobbying to change and what we can do. And so we talked a little bit about how you can connect, making sure that you're up to speed on information, making sure that you're connecting with your local legislators when calls to action occur. If you can, being willing to go to the State House to be there in person, because we know that, for example, the Education Committee hearing of the Senate is an important leveraging point for us to make our voices be heard. But even if you can't be there, to do written testimony, and if you don't know how to do that, we can help you do that. That's what we did last year during the legislative session, is work with people who needed help writing their written testimony that couldn't go to Columbia. So those are just some of the ways that you can connect. Again, connecting with your local legislators and knowing who they are. And then if you have children in school, making sure you're up to speed on what's happening in the school. There was a question about, and this question may be not specifically regarding this. And so I'm wondering if we can, Miss Nairobi, get this last person's contact information, because she's asking about a specific curriculum and wanting some insight into whether a curriculum is effective. And so we can follow up with that question, Ms. Nesbitt. I don't want to ignore it, but most of our panel don't have expertise on one particular kind of curriculum, but I can follow up with you on that one. So I do want to just close us out by, there's an author, his name is Ibram Kendi, and he writes about how to be an anti-racist. And one of the things that he talks about is that we can be anti-racist, or we can be racist. And by supporting systems that support inequity, we're actually supporting racist systems through our inaction. And so we started out talking to you about voting and the importance of connecting and the history of voting and why we got to where we are. We talked to you about the climate and how we got to the point where we have this transparency in education bill. And so I think my last word to implore to you is that no action actually supports the current structure. So we have to do something. We cannot say that we are not political, because by being not political, we're supporting what's currently happening. Ms. Cleo, give us your last word.
Well, just want to remind everybody that this is much bigger than South Carolina. This is a national campaign to convince white people that there is no racism, so that laws can be changed by people who are funding this whole breakdown of the public school system. So we must get involved. And in the famous words of Steve Bannon, the white nationalist, this CRT thing is really working out for us. We can't let that happen. We cannot let that happen.
Thank you. Josh, last word.
We are only losing if we are not fighting back. And there are a number of different ways to fight back. So please follow up with us, spread the word to others, but do whatever you can to join the fight.
Thank you, Josh. AJ, last word.
Yes, public education, the key word in that is public. We must fight to ensure that this very necessary asset, education, is still made available to our most vulnerable populations, and done so in a way that is fair, equitable, and valuable. And that's why being involved and engaged is so critical. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go, Nairobi, can you put that last slide back up with all the coalition websites and Twitter information for our viewers? Please connect. Please join the coalition, Pro-Truth Coalition mailing list. You'll be getting regular information about what's happening. Hop on to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's South Carolina Pro-Truth website to get more information about the bill. There are monthly and coalition calls to stay informed. If you're on social media, join the Pro-Truth Twitter page, the Freedom to Read Facebook and Twitter page, and get connected. We want to thank you for joining us this evening for this conversation, this important conversation. Josh, Ms. Cleo, AJ, thank you so much for giving your time and your expertise around issues that support equitable education for our children. And good night.
Letitia,
Yes,
before you sign us off, there is a black part covering the last 3 lines.
I have no idea why that's there. It's been there on my screen. I thought it was, I'm not projecting, no, so I have no idea.
Okay, so they could get that remaining information. If you
Yeah.
could read it, I don't know if you can.
It's scheduling time with your legislators, and then Freedom to Read SC on Facebook is the last line.
Okay, all right.
Thank y'all
Thank
so
you.
much.
And go to Berkeley County School Board meetings also.
Yes. Y'all, good job. Good conversation.